Mr. Speaker, when it comes to terrorism, there are those who talk about protecting Americans, eliminating threats, securing our borders, as if America can be made impervious to terrorist attacks. Is it really possible to keep America safe in the true sense of the word?
Well, I think that there are substantial dangers. And I think that as the Iranians work to get nuclear weapons, as the North Koreans manufacture nuclear weapons, the dangers grow dramatically greater. And it's a little bit like being in a high-rise building. You know, if you're on a ground floor building, fire is a problem, but it's not necessarily life-threatening.
Right.
But if you're on the 25th floor, you want the building designed so it probably won't catch on fire, so it has a very early detection system, so it smothers the fire as soon as it starts, so you can get out safely. And I think we need to recognize that we live in a world that is interconnected, where people who hate us are going to actively try to kill us if they can, and that there's a great danger they'll eventually get weapons of mass destruction where they can kill many of us. And so in that setting, I think you've got to say, let's do everything we can to minimize the risk, recognizing it's never 100%.
Okay. Also, in many of your speeches, you've identified three primary dangers to the nation's security. One, not surprisingly, is the Democratic Party, or the Democrats. But the other two are radical Islam and competing with China and India, which surprised me a little bit. But on the question of radical Islam, you've said that the United States must defeat radical Islam, and changing a belief system seems a tall order. So I'm wondering what defeat of Islam really looks like. Can you explain that?
Sure. Let me say, first of all, that I think the challenge with China and India is essentially economic and scientific. And if we fix our schools and we fix our tax code and we do the right things here at home, we're fine. Okay. I don't think that they're, in the short run, a direct military challenge. They're a long-term economic and scientific challenge. In the case of radical Islamists, I think it's very important to draw a sharp distinction. The overwhelming majority of Muslims are also the opponents of radical Islamists. Right. If you go over, as I did today, to the Counterterrorism Education Learning Lab, and you look at, they have a place where they have fact and fiction, and one of the, they say fact that, you know, that Christians are the greatest victims of terrorism, and you open up and that's not true, it's false. That the fact is, the most likely person in the world today to be killed by a terrorist is a Muslim who is not subordinating themselves to the demands of the radicals. And so I think we want to consciously have a strategy that says, if you're a radical Islamist and you want to impose Sharia on everyone else, you're over here and you're our opponent. Okay. If you are a Muslim who wants to lead a modern life, obey the law, have a full opportunity for women, be engaged in allowing people to have religious choice without risk of death, we not only don't have any conflict with you, you represent precisely the freedoms we believe in. So I think we need to be clear about the difference in those two groups. Now, the radical Islamists, in the end, and this is very strong language, it's why Callista and I made a movie called America at Risk, so you could see it yourself, you could look at it, you could get a feel for it. The radical Islamists want to impose on everybody else, Muslim and non-Muslim, a set of rules that are essentially medieval. And that includes, for example, that a father can kill their wife or their daughter as a matter of honor, that a brother could kill their sister or their mother as a matter of honor. I don't think there's a single person in this room who believes that. And so you've got to really look at the difference between the radicals and everybody else. We want to openly be the friend of everybody who's not a radical, but relentlessly understand that we are in an ideological, intellectual war with a group of people who would destroy us if they could. Okay.
And so defeating that, what does that look like, though? What does that mean?
It means that there are no more madrasas and mosques teaching hate. It means that there are no more websites recruiting young people into being suicide bombers. It means there are no more people around the planet actively plotting acts of violence. It means that they go from being a genuine threat to being an occasional odd nuisance. And a fundamental difference.
And that's something you think we as a country can do?
I think it's something we as a country have to do. And let me give you an example. There is a cartoonist in Seattle, Washington, named Molly. Mm-hmm. And Molly was actually fairly liberal. And she decided when South Park pulled a particular cartoon that was offensive, she decided to exercise her First Amendment rights. And so she wrote a cartoon for her newspaper that made fun of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. An American imam who has fled to Yemen issued a fatwa saying that any Muslim who could get near her should kill her. Mm. She checked with the FBI, and she's disappeared. I mean, she literally gave up her life. We don't know where she is. We don't know what. Wow. This is in Seattle, Washington. Mm. Now, I don't think we as Americans want to tolerate the idea that any one of us could lose our civil liberties to some fanatic who decides to kill us. This is a real and present threat. Trotsky said many, many years ago, "You may not care about war, but war cares about you." Yeah. And I think we're in the same boat. None of us want to spend our time worrying about terrorism. None of us want to spend our time worrying about people who say, as they did to Salman Rushdie, "You write the wrong novel, we'll kill you." He spent the last 15 years in hiding. Right.
But he's back out now.
He's back out now, and there's a fatwa to kill him from the Iranians.
Let me ask you another question. You've been caustic, really, in your critique of the left on national security. You almost make fun of the national security apparatus as it's run by President Obama. And terrorists, it seems, respect no political party, as we can witness with 9/11. So just wondering, given the Patriot Act and other powers given the government to combat terrorism, what other things do you think, the national security apparatus should be doing? What other powers should it have?
I think a number of the mistakes were bipartisan and also occurred in the Bush administration. So this is not purely, this is as much about the national elite and the national bureaucry.
And the national elite would include Republicans as well as Democrats.
Includes some Republicans and some Democrats. But let me give you an example. A Nigerian banker goes into the U.S. Embassy and briefs 2 CIA representatives and says to them, "My son has gone radical, and I think he's left for Yemen for a terrorist training camp. And if I were you, I wouldn't let him in the U.S."
Right.
Now, I doubt if there's a person in this audience who couldn't understand that sentence.
That's the humor part. Okay.
Well, it gets worse. It gets worse. But let me just carry you a step further.
No, go
I just
right
want to
ahead.
walk you through this for a minute.
Okay.
So, the CIA is not sure that that warning from his father is enough. There's other corroborating evidence that never quite gets put together. And he gets a visa. He leaves Yemen. Now think about it. He goes from Nigeria to Yemen to Amsterdam, deliberately trying to blow up an airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day to create the maximum human damage in the neighborhoods on Christmas Day.
Right.
Now, the people in Yemen taught him how to build a bomb that fits inside his pants, which is something I warned about in 2002.
Right.
Because when we had one shoe bomber, and since then, 8 billion pairs of shoes.
Did you actually count that?
Yeah, I asked my staff to get it. Well, it's an estimate, plus or minus a couple $100 million. But I asked my staff at the American Enterprise Institute, Brady Cassis, who's a brilliant young guy, I said, call TSA and try to figure out how many pairs of shoes do we think it would take? And he said 8 billion seems reasonable.
Okay.
So think about this as asymmetric warfare. One nutcake with a shoe bomb and 8 billion innocent citizens wasting their time taking off their shoes. Right. This may be the biggest return. I mean, everybody, think about this. If you think about long-term economic warfare, that may be the biggest return on investment. I mean, the guy was wearing sneakers. I mean, you know, he bought cheap sneakers. They weren't even expensive sneakers. But so anyway,
Okay.
so starting in 2002, I said, if Al-Qaeda is smart, they're going to watch us taking off our shoes, and they're going to invent underwear bombs. And, you know, you'll presently have 8 billion pair of bras taken off and 8 billion pair of underpants.
That's where we
off.
go next.
Right,
Okay.
go next. Okay.
Okay.
So they finally invent this. The guy puts it on, and it doesn't quite work. So out of all the money we've spent, this is bipartisan, out of all the effort we've put into this, does anybody know he's coming? No. He's on the airplane. What's the first time we learn he's there? The bomb fails to go off, and his pants start to smoke.
Right.
Now, it's little known. I think this was actually suppressed by the Department of Homeland Security, but the passengers at that point broke into two groups. The liberals on the plane don't rush ahead. The liberals on the plane begin yelling, "It's illegal to smoke on an airplane." I'm just going to let you get caught up with yourself before you... The conservatives on the plane say, "It's clear you're a terrorist. We're throwing you out at 28,000 feet, but when we land, we'll try you." Now, let me carry you 3 steps further. I apologize. I think this is...
That's okay.
I think
Go
this
ahead.
is actually educational. So the plane lands. 3 additional examples of how out of touch with reality the current team is. The Secretary of Homeland Security announces the system worked. I mean, she's on video.
Yeah, I've heard that.
She can't get away from it.
Yeah.
Okay. They read him his Miranda rights. He's a foreigner. He doesn't have any Miranda rights.
Right.
He's a combatant. He doesn't have any Miranda rights.
We're gonna get more into that.
Wait a second.
Okay.
Finally, John Brennan, who I think rivals the Attorney General as one of the 2 most destructive people in the administration, is the counterterrorism official in the White House, goes on national television and says, "Well, we really didn't have a smoking gun."
Right.
Now, that is an exact reversal of reality. This is why using criminal law thinking in fighting terrorism is fundamentally wrong. A foreigner planning to attack the United States does not have to be proven guilty. They have to prove to us that they're innocent before we give them a visa. We don't have to prove they're guilty not to issue a visa.
Right.
And Brennan had it exactly backwards.
Okay. So the answer to the question is we need to exercise the authority and the laws and things that we have on the books. Let me move on to one other thing, because you've said that, or at least you've implied that you think some people should be fired, I guess, for the breaches that occurred in the Times Square bombing and the Christmas thing. But to my knowledge, nobody was fired after 9/11, and I'm intrigued by...
And that was a mistake there too.
So who do you think should be fired?
Secretary of Homeland Security, the head of counterterrorism in the White House, and the Attorney General.
And
I think they should fundamentally revisit the whole Director of National Intelligence, because adding 1,500 bureaucrats in Washington did not increase our security. It increased the paperwork and, in fact, diverted large parts of the intelligence community to answering bureaucrats instead of going after bad guys.
And I appreciate that, because I had not heard that level of detail before. Are those the same folks you think who should have been held accountable after the failure of 9/11?
I think after the failure of 9/11, the first person that should have been held accountable was the Director of Intelligence. I mean, that was his job, and they failed. And that goes all the way back into the Clinton years.
1993.
In particular, Michael Scheuer who's written now publicly, he's retired from the CIA. Michael Scheuer was in charge of getting bin Laden in the late 90s. On 2 occasions, he knew where bin Laden was. and could not get the lawyers in the White House to approve killing him.
Right.
Now, Scheuer is very bitter about this. I mean, we'll tell you details about it. The Clinton administration refused to allow the FBI to go into Yemen and to investigate the bombing of the Cole. And in fact, Louis Freeh, the head of the FBI, at one point had to actually go to President George H.W. Bush, who's retired, to get him to call the Saudis, to get the Saudis to answer questions about Khobar Towers, because the Clinton administration wouldn't put any pressure on them. I mean, these are the kind of things you look back. When Bush came in, they were beginning to tighten up. I think they had a long way to go. I think there was a period, probably from 9/11 to about the spring of 2002, where they were very clear about what was going on.
Right.
And then, frankly, it began to be more and more bureaucratic and more difficult. And I think that they also failed to come to grips with how hard this is.
Yeah. I think it's really important to sort of acknowledge that while the top of the administration changes, the sort of security apparatus kind of endures. So that's a very important point. You also noted that the United States needs to pay attention not just to the Middle East, but to Europe and China's vital national security interests. But you focus particular attention on Iran, calling it the most active funder of terrorism on the planet. A lot of the world believes that they're very close to obtaining or developing a nuclear weapon, and just sort of curious about what you think, in addition to sanctions, should be done to stop it.
Well, let me say, first of all, when you describe the need for the United States to not get focused only on the Middle East,
right,
I would also add to the list you had, which I agree with, Mexico, which I think is an enormous challenge, and we have to be worried about it. And in fact, some of the most vicious terrorism on the planet today is the Mexican drug cartels. Iran is an enormous problem. There's a terrific book called Guest to the Ayatollah by Mark Bowden. Mark Bowden is the reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer who wrote Black Hawk Down.
Oh, right.
And the subtitle of Guest to the Ayatollah, it's about the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis. The subtitle is Iran's first attack in its war against America. And what Bowden would tell you is that the current dictatorship has seen itself as actively at war with America since 1979.
Okay.
So for 31 years, they've been doing things. They were clearly behind the killing of 283 Marines in Lebanon in I think it was 83. They were clearly behind the Khobar Towers bombings in the 1990s. They're the primary funders of Hezbollah. They're the primary funders of Hamas. And they funded a substantial amount of the violence in Iraq, and today are meddling in Afghanistan. But the great danger is two things. The one is that this is a big country. I mean, Iran is a very large country and has a large population. And they are methodically building nuclear weapons. And people talk and they posture and the UN passes resolutions and the Iranians just keep building. And it's an enormous danger because if they get nuclear weapons, the second thing we don't tend to take into account is that Ahmadinejad represents a religious fanaticism which would regard dying as a good thing. Remember, when you deal with an enemy who is a suicide bomber, it's impossible to deter them.
Right.
Because what are you going to threaten? They've already decided they'll give their life. Well, if you have one of the leading spokespersons for that kind of behavior who suddenly gets nuclear weapons, and you say to him, boy, if you take out Tel Aviv, we're going to take out Tehran. He may go, okay, 1 for 1. But he'll think he wins. Because in his worldview, everyone in Tel Aviv will go to hell and everyone in Tehran will go to heaven. And so, in fact, it'll be a terrific experience because look at all the people who enter paradise.
Right.
Now, that may sound nutty, but if you read what they actually say, it is very sobering.
So what should be done to stop that?
Well, I believe, and Clist and I made 2 movies. One was Ronald Reagan, A Rendezvous with Destiny, and the other is called 9 Days That Changed the World, about Pope John Paul II going to Poland in 1979. And one of the reasons we made the 2 movies was to show people that in the 1980s, you had between Prime Minister Thatcher, President Reagan, and Pope John Paul II, a deliberate, conscious, economic, military, political, diplomatic, intellectual strategy to break the Soviet Empire.
Right.
And they did it without any shots being fired in Eastern Europe. I mean, if you think about it, it's one of the most amazing strategic achievements in history. In 1980, the Soviet Union looks invulnerable. In 1991, it disappears. The Iranian dictatorship's not that strong. I mean, if we were out there methodically every morning helping younger Iranians who hate the regime, if we had a powerful electronic presence on radio, on the internet, on television, consciously helping younger Iranians, if we were prepared to subsidize everybody who opposed the regime, if we cut off the flow of gasoline, they have to import 40% of their gasoline. They produce lots of oil, but they don't have any refineries.
Right.
You could, I think, realistically replace this regime in a way that would startle the world, because it's not a very strong regime. It's a brittle regime that's very violent.
So regime change. Okay.
Absolutely. When you have people who are utterly irrational, which I think Ahmadinejad by our standards is, trying to figure out how to be nice to them.
Yeah.
You know, couldn't you be sort of pleasantly crazy for a while? It's not a winning. It's not a winning strategy. It doesn't get you to the future you've got to be in. You cannot tolerate this dictatorship having nuclear weapons. Period.
So the elephant in the room on that issue really is the experience with Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. I mean, you know, there was all kind of supposed evidence out there about what Saddam Hussein had, and I'm not sure that a convincing case has been made about what Ahmadinejad, what he really has.
I mean, unlike,
is that something that people in America should be skeptical about?
Well, let me divide it into two parts.
Okay.
First of all, on Iraq, I went through, because at the time I was on the Defense Policy Board, I went through the debriefings on lessons learned by the Joint Forces Command after the war. They interviewed all the Iraqi senior generals. They all thought Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And they would all say, oh yeah, we had them, they were down the, go ask General so-and-so, he must have had them. And what they discovered after then they went at this for weeks. If we had had Saddam's girlfriend as our spy, she would have told us he has weapons of mass destruction. He thought he had weapons of mass destruction. And it turned out, when you pulled all this apart, the reason he thought he had weapons of mass destruction was he had this leadership technique that if you gave him bad news, he killed you. And so people over a 20-year period had gotten in the habit of saying, program's really coming along good, big guy. I mean, we want you to know we're not very far away from what you want. And they would, first of all, try to hide and never meet with him. And if they had to meet with him, they'd find some good news. Right. So at one level, I would say a lot of the contempt and cynicism is ideological. Tony Blair honestly believed they had weapons of mass destruction. The Italian, Russian, French, and British intelligence all thought they had weapons of mass destruction. So it's not just the US CIA, it's not just Bush and Cheney. There was a general consensus worldwide. Right. Putin brought his chief of intelligence over, who said, yes, we, the Russians, believe they have these weapons. So I just want to set the Iraqi case to one side. Now let's come to the Iranian case. The International Atomic Energy Agency says flatly they have cyclotrons that are working to build nuclear weapons. The Iranians say they have a weapon of mass destruction program. We can show you sites. I mean, this is a case where we know they have reactors. We know they're trying to do it. They say they're trying to do it. But I would also say this, and I think this is not a bad rule, and this may strike some of you as being too strong. If a country wants to bluff us into believing it's trying to get weapons of mass destruction, and as a result we eliminate its regime, that might teach other regimes not to try to bluff us.
Okay. Do you need to see anything else? Do you want to see anything else?
About Iran?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. All right, good enough. Okay. You've written about this, and the Department of Homeland Security recently talked about sort of the internal, sort of homegrown threat when it comes to terrorism, that it's increased in the past year, and you've alluded to some of those kinds of things. But can you comment about this development and what you think the United States can do to sort of manage or address it?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be dramatically more aggressive in taking on the radicals outside the United States, because that's where the primary information comes from.
Okay.
I mean, a great deal of the recruiting is done on the internet. We should have a policy of knocking out every internet site that has radicalism in it. And we should have a policy of communicating that if you're actively, you know, and I think, by the way, President Obama has done the right thing on this American imam who's now hiding in Yemen, who openly calls for the killing of Americans. The president has apparently signed a national security document authorizing his being killed. And I think the fact is, when you decide to fight the United States, you are a traitor. When you are a traitor, you do not come under U.S. civil law. You're in a totally different league. And I don't think we can tolerate people. And I want to go back to something Abraham Lincoln said. Lincoln, at one point, ends up with a former congressman who's about to run for governor of Ohio, Vallandigham is his name,
right,
who is advocating desertion from the Union Army. And he is arrested for undermining the Union Army. And people say, you know, free speech. And Lincoln says, as commander-in-chief, I have to decide whether or not to execute an 18-year-old farm boy who deserts because he hears this clever agitator encourage him to desert. But you don't want me to do anything to the agitator who caused his death. He said, how can you do that? We need to adopt a policy that says anyone, anywhere who advocates killing for the purpose of defeating us should expect us to come and find them. They don't need to actually go out and do the killing. The act of advocating the killing should be unacceptable to every American, and we should be defended from that kind of fanaticism.
Okay. So, I think they might let me get to some political questions, but before I do that, I wanted to give you...
No, Larry told me not to be political.
Yeah, I know. Well, don't be too political. Just on the broader point about China and India, I just want you to talk a little bit more about that, because, you know, those are huge nations, they're huge markets. You know, why categorize them as threats, and exactly what do you mean?
Okay. But let me say one thing about China in particular for a second, because this is an example of not being a serious country.
Of us not being a serious country.
No, it's not being serious. We have difficulty getting the Chinese to decide that they would go along with sanctions with Iran. If we were saying, and I want everyone just listen to the logic train here. We are worried because they may get nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons could eliminate one city per weapon. We would like to not lose any cities. It is worth our while to say to the Chinese, you don't have to recognize our sanctions. You don't have to recognize our blockade of gasoline. But by the way, from Tuesday morning on, you will sell no products in the United States. You will be in an industrial depression, and we won't deal with it. I mean, this idea that the largest economy on the planet and the largest provider of urban employment in China is helpless and has to tiptoe around and has to allow the Russians and the Chinese to set the terms of the relationship is a total misunderstanding of the nature of the real world. So I think we have to communicate, no, you would never get to that. You'd say to them, first of all, we don't think you want to lose Shanghai, and we don't want to lose New York. Therefore, we obviously are on the same side. And we'd love to have you help us get this done, or we'd love to have you stay out of the way.
Okay.
But of course, if you got in the way, there would be consequences. And you get to decide. You're a free country. Now, here's what I mean by national security challenges. From 1840 to today, we have been the leading scientific, technological, industrial power in the world. And as a result, we could simultaneously organize as an arsenal of democracy to defeat Japan, Germany, and Italy at the same time, and we could win the Second World War in 3 years and 8 months. We could contain the Soviet Empire from 1947 to 1991 because the relative margin of our capability was so enormous.
Right.
For the first time since 1840, we have two large countries that are rapidly modernizing. And that's good, by the way. They have every right to pursue happiness. Every Indian and Chinese has a full right to become prosperous. And that's not a threat to us.
Okay.
But what we have to do is be honest about this. I prefer my grandchildren live in a world where the United States is the most prosperous, the safest, and the freest country in the world, because I have relative confidence in the American rule of law and the idea that we will be a relatively benign country. I would think I was leaving them a much more dangerous future if we had slid to number 2 and an authoritarian Chinese dictatorship was the most powerful country in the world, and we didn't know its intentions. And we didn't know whether or not we could, in fact, convince it not to do things that dramatically changed the world we lived in.
Okay.
So I think that our long-term national strategy is actually domestic. It's reforming litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure, so we remain the leading country in the world economically. And that's not about China, it's about us. If we do our job, they're not going to compete with us. If we don't do our job, we're going to be number 2.
Okay. I think you've sort of said if we're not a powerful economy, we can't fund our national interests.
Yeah,
so.
and we won't have the technology to be number 1. I mean, one of the great advantages we had over both the Axis powers in World War II and over the Soviets is our science was just dramatically better than theirs. Well, I don't want to get to a point where Chinese and Indian science is dramatically better than ours, and we don't have a clue what they're capable of because our guys don't know what they're doing.
So what would you say to American companies that are exporting jobs and, creating those opportunities over there?
I would say, tell us the tax code, the litigation code, the regulation code that will convince you to build the next factory here.
Okay. Good.